Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session 3F, Secondary Resources New Certification Scheme for Recycling of Critical Raw Materials. It's a session specially on a project with this title, the CEWASTE project. And I will welcome the speakers who are all working together in this project. This is actually the last parallel session of this conference. So I hope many people join and enjoy these presentations. My name is Mathias Schluep. I'm the Managing Director of the World Resources Forum. I will chair this session together with Deepali from Sofias in India. Then I would like to introduce Otmar Deubzer for the first presentation. Otmar is a scientific advisor at the United Nations Universities at the Sustainable Cycles Program. I still don't know, Otmar, maybe you can explain that you're on the move to actually another organization. So if I have to announce you as UNU or UNITA. In the CEWASTE project, he led the process for identification of key products and equipment for recycling of CRMs. And the title of the presentation is Products, Technologies, and Normative Requirements for Recycling of Valuable and Critical Raw Materials. Otmar, please, it's your floor.
Thank you, Matthias. Yeah, actually, I'm still United Nations University, but it's the last weeks probably, and I will switch to UNITAR like the entire CITL group. But in this project, we worked as UNITAR. And when I say in this project, so you might be interested to know what actually this project is. We took up the challenge that so far the recycling rates of critical raw materials are generally very low. And it's the Commission's the EU policy, an objective in the EU to increase this recycling rates. And our approach to contribute to this was to set up requirements for the recycling of critical raw materials from key CRM products, as we call them, which of course we first had to define. And this is the core of this presentation. Next, please. When we speak of key CRM equipment, yeah, first of all, we had to define some criteria, how to identify them. The first one is pretty obvious. It's the material focus. We focused on those materials which were listed on the critical raw materials list, the Commission's one from 2017, and made a slight update based on the 2020 list. The product focus, we focused on WEEE and on batteries from WEEE, and also batteries of end-of-life vehicles. But then we had to define some more conditions. It's clear that you need to have, first of all, the possibility, a technical possibility for end treatment of the products and the fractions thereof. So it must be technically feasible to do this. And then it must also be possible that the input which is needed in the final process can be generated in the pre-treatment. Another important thing with a view to the economic side of recycling is that the CRM recycling should not conflict with the precious metal recycling, because they are driving the recycling business in the end, and also from the ecological point of view, sacrificing the precious metals for the critical raw materials would not really be a good option. And then, yeah, it's about the money, of course. But what we said is, not yet, please. What we said is we do not look at the economic feasibility under the current framework conditions. So we would assume that these could be changed. And if critical raw material recycling is a political is what the Commission or the politicians want, and we as a society, then someone must pay for it. We did such a move already with the introduction of the WEEE directive, that we provided funding for recycling activities which before were economically not feasible. But of course, this has its limits, so we excluded hopeless cases, which were in most cases devices which had tiny amounts of some critical raw materials on a tiny component somewhere. I mean, there it can be expected that there's a strong disbalance between benefit and cost. Next, please. So, and what you see here is our proud result. This is sorted not according to products, but according to the source components which we identified, which contain most of the precious and also the critical raw materials. It's printed circuit boards, and we find them in computers, laptops, but also in mobile phones, tablets, and in external disk drives and so on. Of course, the most interesting ones are the high grades with high contents of precious metals and palladium. Palladium is the only precious metal which at the same time, at the current time being, is also a critical raw material. Then lithium-ion batteries, not quite surprising. You can recycle cobalt and lithium. So that's for lithium. For cobalt, it already happens. For lithium, it does not yet happen, really, so a bit in between. Lead-acid batteries, they contain antimony, so can be recycled, and this is actually already going on. You find them, of course, not only in cars, but also in some uninterrupted power supplies and in some other WEEE like e-scooters. Fluorescent powders from fluorescent lamps, first of all, but also from CRT monitors and CRT TVs. You find them in the fluorescent powders, and you see quite a lot of different rare earth elements in particular, which can be recycled or which could be recycled already until 2016, when this operation was stopped due to the dropping prices of the rare earth elements, but it's technically feasible. And finally, neodymium magnets, as we find them in laptops, hard disk drives, desktop computers, e-bikes also, and in all kinds of engines, including from electrical vehicles in particular. From there, of course, it's not only neodymium, but also some other rare earth elements which can be recycled, which, however, does not yet happen. We could identify, however, processes which are close to, can be expected to be industrialized in the foreseeable future, so that the technical feasibility is given by them. Next, please. And then if you want to set up requirements for recycling, maybe then it's good to look to the left and to the right. What others have already done to avoid, of course, wasting the EU's money for research, so to be more efficient and effective. We analyzed around 60 normative requirements, which we thought could be somehow relevant for the key CRM equipment. The main finding is there are hardly any technical requirements which are specific for CRM recycling. There are several more general ones for environmental management and so on, which could, of course, be used for our purposes as well. But the biggest gap are the technical requirements, which we then have to develop also. And to fill the gap, we decided to use first the EN 5625 series as a first general reference and see what is in there. And if there is a gap in there for our needs, then we can look at other standards. And as a last resort, we actually start working and fill the gaps with new technical and other requirements, which we then have to develop ourselves. Next, please. The next is Shahrzad. So this is the end of my part of the presentation. I think we continue, Matthias, or questions? as you like.
No, the questions come at the end, actually. Okay. So we just go through all the presentations and then we'll have the questions at the end. So next speaker is my colleague, Shahrzad Manoochehri. She's project manager at the WRF, mainly involved in projects related to primary and secondary resources, responsible sourcing and circular economy. So Shahrzad actually coordinated the CEWASTE projects on behalf of the WRF, and she will talk about CEWASTE requirements for sound recycling and transboundary movements of WEEE with critical raw materials. Shahrzad, please go ahead.
Thank you, Matthias, for the introduction, and thanks to all participants who selected our session among so many interesting workshops and scientific sessions that are this year offered by the World Resources Forum Conference. As it was explained by Otmar, after conducting the baseline analysis to understand the situation, identify the key equipment and components, and to have an overview of the existing standards, we then focused on developing normative requirements for recycling of critical raw materials as a key component of the CEWASTE certification scheme. Development of the CEWASTE requirements was an iterative process with several rounds of reviews and revisions that were done both internally by the project partners and also externally through conducting open and public consultation process. This consultation process was in accordance with the ICIL Code of Good Practice for developing sustainability standards. The requirements that we develop cover various aspects such as managerial, sustainability, traceability, and technical requirements related to different stages and different operators in the value chain, including collection points, collection facilities, logistics operators, pre-treatment, and final treatment facilities. Next slide, please. When starting with this project, a key principle that we considered was that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, meaning that we didn't intend to create a new standard from scratch, but we wanted to build on the existing standards and guidelines related to the field of electrical and electronic waste treatment and responsible sourcing of the raw materials. With this in mind, our goal, our general approach for developing the requirements was based on the following steps that we partly heard from Otmar, that we adopted the Senelec standards, the EN 50625 standard series as the basis of our work. And where the EN 50625 standard series was not enough for our purpose, we gave reference to other standards and guidelines that are already available. And then in the cases that we could not find the relevant requirements in other references or other existing standards, we developed new requirements. These new requirements were mainly covering technical requirements for 4 key components that were introduced again in the first presentation: waste batteries, waste magnets, fluorescent powders, and printed circuit boards. Moreover, we developed traceability and sustainability requirements that were not addressed or not fully addressed in existing standards. Regarding the traceability requirements, we also acknowledge the relevant source from the OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible business conduct and develop requirements applicable to lead acid batteries and printed circuit boards, with the aim to prevent the risk of shipment of these types of waste from operators who do not comply with these normative requirements. Also, we provided guidance and recommendations on cases where national requirements were not available in the countries where the facilities are located. Next slide, please. The structure of the CEWASTE document follows the Senelec standard structure, basically because of the applicability and the further or future integration of these requirements into the Senelec standard. For example, when looking at the technical requirements in clause 5, we followed the same structure and developed new requirements or new sub-clauses were needed. This can also be seen in clause 4 of the document, where we created new sub-clauses for traceability and sustainability requirements. Next slide, please. And the last but not the least point that I would like to mention is that for the elaboration of the sea-based requirements, we considered 6 guiding principles. And as you can see them in this chart, these were including the technological and economic feasibility, as were discussed also in the first presentation, optimal collection, sorting, and removal, continuous improvements, specifically for the managerial requirements that is needed for efficient implication of the technical requirements, auditability of the process, and as well as traceability. This was from my side. Thanks for your attention, and back to you, Matthias and Deepali.
Thanks, Shahrzad.
Thanks, Shahrzad. So from kind of the baseline now, and then to developing the principles, we move on to more the assurance and verification system, because without that we cannot follow up on the principles. And this we will have a presentation by Yifaat Baron3, who is a technical expert and manager of ROS and ELV activities at Öko Institute. Yifaat led the development of the assurance and verification system for the sea waste scheme. And yeah, I think the title is clear. I already talked about the Yifaat. Please go ahead.
Next slide to come up. Okay. So after we developed basically a set of requirements for CRM recycling, it was also necessary to understand what needs to be developed in order to ensure that they will actually be implemented. For that purpose, we developed what we call the sea waste scheme. On the one side, this needed to provide the framework for certification of the compliance of the waste management value chain. And on the other side, we also needed to make sure basically that the assessments of the requirements would be done in a homogeneous way. In that sense, basically on the one side, the scheme has 2 main parts: the assurance system on the one side, which for that purpose, we developed, let's say, what we call the scheme rules, the framework basically for the functioning of the complete system, how different processes work and things like that. And the second part basically is the verification system, which in line with these different processes, basically also, also develops different tools, different methods basically in order to make sure that the verification follows a certain process and is performed basically in a similar fashion by different auditors in different facilities. Next slide. So basically today I'd like to show you a little bit of the verification scheme. This system basically follows the different stages of the certification process. So starting already from the beginning, from the application part of a certain facility for an application, then following receipts of such an application, an audit plan is developed. This is something we developed a template for, so that auditors, when planning basically an audit, could make sure basically that they plan it in a certain way in terms of time, that they make sure that the various people at the plant are taken into consideration, etc. For not yet. For the audit itself, we developed on the one side what we called the checklist, a checklist tool, and this was combined with a later stage basically of also developing manuals to support the audit and also to support the operator in preparation for the process and also in holding basically the audits themselves. Then the next stage is basically following the audit. There is an assessment of the different information and documentation that has been provided. And for that purpose, we also put together a kind of template to be used for this assessment to make sure that basically that all the various aspects that have been discovered during the audit are put together and feed into the final decision. And finally, we also prepared a template basically for the certification, basically the final stage, the decision if a certain facility is going to be certified or not. Next slide. So our time today is quite limited. So basically what I wanted to do is just show you a little bit how the checklist tool functions. So this was basically something that combines on the one side, again, this checklist, and on the other side, a manual. So in this case, we're looking basically at the checklist tool and how it has been prepared basically for the auditors themselves. So on the one side, in relation to each of the requirements, we have, in relation to the different requirements, we have basically for each requirement a question. In some cases, we saw that there were requirements that were similar. So we have references maybe also to a different requirement and only one question, which is to be taken into consideration in deciding basically if the requirement is fulfilled or not. We built in quite a lot of filtering options into this tool so that in the preparation of an audit, for example, the auditor can go can see basically what the type of WEEE is that is going to be looked at, what is the auditing scope, for example, if he's in a facility that has already been certified to Senelec, since in the standard we have quite a lot of Senelec requirements, so that he can filter these out and only look at them, let's say, sporadically. So basically we tried on the one side to make sure that this tool supports the audit itself and in the sense of asking the correct questions. Antonia, if you can click. If you can click one time, not going exactly, then the last part, just because the tool is too wide, we also have at the end basically what we call the manual. So in this sense, also for each of the requirements, we have additional information that has been included. So both in the preparation and in the assessment itself of each requirement, there is kind of additional information that can be taken into consideration in the decision, has the requirement been fulfilled or not. The tool also includes various background information from the standard itself, and it also includes basically a compilation of all of the cases in where a certain requirement is not fulfilled, so that it basically facilitates the final assessment. Finally, after developing the various tools, we first of all had a set of pilot audits that will be explained about by Esther in the next presentation. So this was one of the aspects that allowed us basically to check if the tools and the templates that we were developed were fit for purpose. And that gave us various feedback that then went in for a further fine-tuning basically of the different tools. And we also had a consultation with stakeholders in relation to the requirements, which also fed in basically to last changes performed basically in the tools themselves. In that sense, both of these things basically were taken into consideration, and we did one final review. Thank you very much. Matthias, I give you the floor back.
Thank you, Yifaat. And of course, as it is, if we have a verification system, we also have to test this out, no? The whole certification scheme actually. And Esther actually took care of that, and together with the Sofia's team, and she will present us the pilot testing of the CEWASTE certification scheme. Esther is a senior consultant at Sofia's, where she supports and manages projects in the field of circular economy, material flow analysis, and modeling, product lifetime, recyclability of products, materials and substances, and environmental impacts, etc. And of course, CEWASTE project was perfect fitting into her portfolio. So Esther, please, you have to turn on your camera, I think, and you can go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for this introduction. Is the video showing now?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, very good. So as Yifaat said in her last slide, and also Matthias said, after developing the CEWASTE requirements and these verification tools and templates, it was time to go out to real life operational settings and test them in a set of pilot audits. We carried out 20 pilot audits between March and December 2020, and we selected 13 companies to cover the whole chain from collection, logistics to pre-treatment and final treatment, with a strong focus on pre-treatment. We took into considerations facilities in Europe, in Belgium, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Switzerland that were already EN 5625 certified, as well as facilities outside of Europe, in Colombia, Rwanda, and Turkey that were without EN 5625 certification. Originally, all audits were planned to be physical, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, almost half of the audits had to be conducted virtually, and where this 0.5 comes from. We had a team of auditors that included consortium members from the CEWASTE project that were experienced in auditing, plus we also had external auditors that we trained on the CEWASTE requirements through various webinars. Additionally, we also developed a questionnaire that was sent to 5 PROs for input on the feasibility and the relevance of CEWASTE requirements on collection. Next slide, please. So the pilot's audits served a dual purpose. First of all, we wanted to receive feedback on the feasibility and the relevance of the CEWASTE requirements, but also on the verification tools and templates from both the auditors and the operators. And then we wanted to assess the extent to which CEWASTE requirements are already complied with. So kind of test the readiness level on various regions in the world, as well as the effort needed to reach compliance. The audits resulted in more than 600 comments that were provided by the auditors and the operators. So it proved to be a very useful and necessary step to improve the CEWASTE scheme. All these comments were then reviewed by the consortium partners, and it was decided how a revision of the normative requirements, the assurance systems, and the verification procedures could be done. Next slide, please. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we also learned some very important lessons about virtual audits. Virtual audits proved to be very useful to verify compliance to and discuss management requirements, since operators can share the relevant documents on the screen and the auditors can have a look at right away and check compliance. However, for technical requirements, it was quite difficult to verify compliance, although we had some pictures, some videos, or even virtual site visits that helped us verifying empirical evidence. But especially these virtual site visits can be technologically quite challenging, and it did not really work out very often. We also learned that virtual audits are not always the right format. It was difficult to find collection points for virtual audits, and that's why we decided to use a questionnaire format in order to collect feedback on the collection requirements. And here you see a picture of a virtual audit at the facility in Turkey. And yeah, the audits were very interesting, still virtual, but of course it would have been nicer to sit around a table with these people. This was my input to the pilot audits. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And back to Matthias.
Thank you, Esther. So yeah, once we have developed this is actually a full-fledged standard, and with requirements, with an audit scheme, we test it out. Now, of course, it's also the question what we do with that, no? And Marina Porto, she will talk about the roadmap for long-term sustainability of the CEWASTE scheme. Marina is a sustainability consultant at Sofias, and her main areas of expertise is circular economy, climate change, and public policy. So please, Marina.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And we're going to talk a little bit then about the roadmap to how to implement the CEWASTE scheme that we talked before. So to begin with, we would like to talk a little bit about a set of integrated options we have outlined. And the idea is that these options could be implemented to ensure more feasibility of the recovery processes of critical raw materials. So we are going to go through the policy cycle and starting with legislation. So one option of policy here, it's to implement legal obligation to recover critical raw materials. The other would be to have mandatory recycled content for critical raw materials, such as for batteries, and economic, for example, gate, VAT exemption, and tax credits to recyclers. If we could go to the next, please. Yes. The next part of the policy cycle would be the implementation. So for example, creation of our markets for critical raw materials, improving the critical infrastructure for recycling of specific raw materials and products. So improving the infrastructure could bring cost efficiency, and the new collection models and grouping of CRM-rich products, which could also bring efficiencies to the chain and cost savings. And of course, making it more feasible and efficient, that's what we are looking for. Next, please. Part then is monitoring and reporting. And here we can, for example, digital product passports. That is a super interesting EU project right now where we could make available for different appliances a lot of information about the products, its environmental impact, and a lot on traceability. And I think here we also tackle a lot of the principles that Shahrzad mentioned, traceability being one of them, and economic incentives and some others, of course. Next, please. And last but not least, none of this is possible without enforcement. So we also need to focus on enforcement. And here one example is enforcement of European rules to counter illegal waste export of KCE from the EU to other countries. So here are some policy options that we can look to have a success implementation of the CEWASTE. Next, please. And we have a few key points of adoption that we need to rely on. Yeah, just click it. So we already know that the recovery of critical raw materials is a priority for the EU, and that's also why this study is here to show us. And the main prerequisite for adoption of the CEWASTE is to make the EN 5625 the standard legally mandatory. Next. And after this, to make the CEWASTE standard mandatory as well, because voluntary standards can only have a minor impact and would lead to low or no recovery of CRMs as it's non-enforceable. And one more. And also we recommend that the CNLEC would be the owner of the CEWASTE scheme, while the WILABEX would be the owner of the certification part. We can go to the next. And now we would like to introduce the roadmap of how we can make this possible. So building a little bit on what I just said, we would have to make the CNLEC standard mandatory to begin with. And then I think you can just click, then we can make it a bit more efficient. To make the CEWASTE standard mandatory as part of the CNLEC standard. Then we need to propose a call to action for member states to increase the collection of CRM-rich materials, then create a market pool to promote the use of recovered metals, for example, establishing minimal amount of recycled materials, then facilitate the creation for recycled, the creation of demand for recycled components of materials. And there are several ways of doing it. For example, increasing awareness of consumers when that would then demand more recycled and sustainable materials in this direction. Then push for more policies and investments to ensure economic viability of the processes, including for recyclers. So we know that one of the barriers right now is the cost, and we need policies that can help us achieve that. And some of the options are the ones we mentioned on the first slide here. And last but not least, to push for research and development of technologies for better and more efficient processes, so we can extract more CRMs from the same amount of materials to begin with, the same amount of collected materials, and decrease the costs, therefore promoting more efficiency and more feasible processes that would drive up the recovery up. So I think that's it, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Marina. Actually, I would like to give the word to Deepali and to see if we have any questions from the chat or from the Q&A session.
We don't actually, Matthias. It's either all very clear, crystal clear, and nobody has any questions, or everyone's still kind of thinking and absorbing. But I know there are quite a few participants, and really like you to take this chance to type in the question and answer box. You can raise your hand, or you can put it on the chat as well. So yeah, I'm sure there are questions out there. If you might want some clarifications, if there are any other ideas, maybe to expand this, I don't know if you have something. If not, I can start with the first question. Sure. And yeah, it's around, as to what you mentioned, the challenges or the benefits of doing these audits virtually. And do you see this also kind of becoming more common, and how can, some of those safeguards be included while doing audits virtually? Because first of all, it's efficient, then also it's practical. Or do you think it's really necessary to have a physical component at least? To audit again something like this?
I think it's both. I think virtual audits can be quite useful, also quite efficient, because we don't have to fly around or travel around so much. And I think maybe for follow-up audits, it's a very useful format. I think for first audits and facilities that the auditors don't know, it's not very useful, because first of all, you really have to see the processes, understand what they're doing. And I think then it's really very helpful if you're on site. But then, for example, if you have a yearly turnus or every second year, maybe you can do one physical audit and the next one virtual, and then the next one physical again, something like that. I think we cannot just say, let's do all the audits virtual from now on. I think that won't work if there is some technical things involved. But I think it's really interesting and something that we need to look at to just become more efficient.
Great, thanks for that, Esther. Anyone else with any other questions? I don't see any hands raised either. Also checking the WOVA chat, but nothing there.
I would have a follow-up question on that, on the audits actually, because and on the checklist and everything, because what we always hear, from recyclers also, and say, oh, there's another standard, so I have to go through another procedure. So I spend half of the year with auditors checking my facility. So how practical was it received, the audits, and what did the recycler say? Like, okay, that fits to it, and how did you try to actually not make it a further burden, but rather integrate it maybe in existing procedures? I don't know if this is for Yifaat or for Esther or for both.
I can at least answer in terms of what we did, how we took it into consideration in the tools themselves, because this was definitely a comment that we received through the piloting, particularly for facilities that were also certified for Senelec or certified to different ISO standards that particularly in the management part, there were a lot of requirements that were very similar to requirements in some of these other standards. And it's something that we definitely took into consideration a little bit. The problem is that we discussed internally that when you go to a facility, the fact that it has already been certified doesn't necessarily mean that you can be 100% sure. So what we basically, what we recommended basically in that sense is not to do a complete full audit, for example, of Senelec requirements. In such cases, you do have the filtering options, but you should take a look maybe just at a few to get a feeling for it. And on that basis, be able to say, okay, the facility has been certified, we checked a few, it seems okay. We go on basically to focus on the specific requirements that we developed for CRMs.
Okay, thanks. Sounds good. Now I just see that there is a Q&A. There's one and by Carlos Hernandez from Colombia. What do you think could be the role of emerging economies countries in reaching such CRM objectives? I don't know who want to take up the question.
Maybe I can give it a try if you allow.
Please, Otmar.
Thank you. I think what is crucial if we look at how to process, how to make it feasible that the critical raw materials can be recycled, in the early separation of the parts containing the critical raw materials is essential. Because you have to remove them in principle before you do any further steps which are related to shredding and mechanical separation, because this will just dilute them over the entire fraction, and the possibly already not so high quantity or concentration is diluted further. And in many cases, this can imply manual work. So I think that in countries which are low-income countries, not meaning that this is a country where you can have cheap labor and exploit people, meaning countries where the standard or the cost of living is not so high, and at the same time then the salaries are not so high. This could be an option maybe to do more work here there to actually then really make to improve the situation, that we can separate them and then put them into the respective processes before anything else happens to the device.
Great, thanks for that, Otmar. Carlos, would you have any other follow-up questions on that? That was, I think,
we can offer them. We can start an export-import business.
Yeah.
I would have another question, probably for Marina. You said, you recommend that this should not be voluntary, should be mandatory, because we started the project as a voluntary certification scheme. I mean, what does the industry say about if we say now it should become mandatory?
Just thank you for the question, Matthias. I'm just wondering if Federico wants to take this one, or should I?
I think it's fine. I mean, I can also answer. Matthias, we did this project in strong cooperation with the industry as well, with ERA in particular, and we know there is a strong demand for mandatory recycling standards coming from industry. Not only from recyclers, but also from producers. And at least here in Europe, there is this very big demand. And for me, it's really good that we have on one hand industry that is asking for mandatory standard, but also, during the project that we realized that when it comes to recovery of CRM, we cannot keep this at a voluntary basis. We need economy of scale. We need to concentrate material. We need to concentrate the fractions. This will never work if we only leave a few companies or few players doing that. So I think there's really no other way. This needs to be mandatory. It's a political priority of the Commission. We know since many years. And it's really time that the political priority is followed by, concrete policy actions.
Okay, thanks. That was quite clear. And then maybe there's one last question, probably for Otmar. You talked about the hopeless cases. And if I hear now Federico say, I mean, first, is it fair to talk about hopeless cases from a resource conservation perspective? And then second, if I listen to Federico, if this has to become mandatory anyways, is there no way to say, okay, we have other possibilities to make the hopeless cases maybe also economically viable?
Yeah, I mean, a hopeless case is not only defined by the price of treatment, it's also defined by the expenses you need to get out the critical raw materials, expenses in terms of energy, in terms of water and other resource consumption. So recycling and treatment is not for free. It also consumes energy and efforts. And then if you have to do really high efforts just to end up with a few milligrams of some things, I think that's still a hopeless case. And maybe if you really want to test this, it might be advisable to do an LCA, for example, also on this, to see how the situation looks like, and if we really take a broader look. I think additionally, if people feel that there is a strong disbalance between the cost, whoever has to pay it, and the effort required on the one hand and the benefit, then it will not be accepted easily, even if it's mandatory. So I think there are many reasons to focus on those fractions where we can expect that there's, maybe currently not yet economically feasible, but with a reasonable financing, it has a reasonable benefit at a reasonable effort.
Okay, thanks, perfect. We are exactly 4:20. Deepali, is there anything from the chat and you want to expand a little bit, or is it all fine?
All good. I don't see any other questions. Oh, no, one is there. Actually, there is an open question. Oh, just saying, Carlos saying thanks. Okay.
Okay.
No other questions then. But it was really interesting. Thanks to all the presenters. Yeah, there is a link to the CEWA site, and I think all the documents and the reports and everything are available online. So I hope everyone has a chance to go through this. Those who are listening in and can then reach out to the
presenters for any other further questions.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks,
maybe
everyone.
See you.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.